Jeff Beck thought he'd discovered something nobody else could do. Then Jimi Hendrix picked up a guitar and showed him the difference between technique and music. It was late spring 1967, London. The British rock scene was exploding with innovation. Every week brought a new sound, a new band, a new guitar player trying to push boundaries. Jeff Beck was at the center of it all. At 23 years old, he'd already made his mark with the Yardbirds, playing alongside Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page in that legendary lineup. Now he was on his own, exploring sounds that other guitarists hadn't imagined yet. Beck was obsessed with technique. While other players focused on blues feeling or rock attitude, Beck studied the mechanics of the instrument. He spent hours in his flat working out new fingerings, new approaches, new ways to make the guitar do things it wasn't designed to do. He discovered something recently that excited him more than anything he'd found before. A technique where both hands worked on the fretboard simultaneously, tapping notes instead of picking them. It created cascading runs of notes that sounded impossible, almost like a keyboard rather than a guitar. Nobody else was doing it. Not Clapton, not Page, not Townshend. Just him. The gathering that night was at a small club in Soho, one of those basement venues that hosted after-hours sessions for musicians. No audience, no press, just players jamming, sharing ideas, pushing each other. Beck arrived around 11 with his Telecaster, the guitar that had become an extension of his body. He'd been thinking about his new technique all day, eager to show someone, to see their reaction when they realized what he was doing. The club was dimly lit, smoke hanging in the air, maybe 30 people scattered around small tables. Beck recognized most of them. Session musicians, producers, a few journalists who knew how to keep quiet about what they saw at these gatherings. And in the corner, sitting quietly with a drink, was Jimi Hendrix. Beck had heard about Jimi. Everyone had. The American guitarist who'd arrived in London 6 months earlier and immediately started turning heads. Beck had seen him perform once, been impressed by the showmanship and the volume, but he'd had reservations. Too much flash, he'd thought. Too much reliance on effects and stage tricks. Beck respected technical ability above all else, and he wasn't sure Jimi had the discipline, the precision that real mastery required. Someone suggested Beck play something. He didn't need much encouragement. He plugged into a small Fender amp, adjusted the tone, and started demonstrating his new technique. His right hand tapped notes on the fretboard, while his left hand simultaneously hammered on and pulled off other strings, creating a flowing cascade of notes that seemed to multiply impossibly fast. The effect was mesmerizing. People stopped talking and watched his hands work. Beck played for maybe 3 minutes, showing different applications of the technique, different musical contexts where it could be used. When he finished, there was genuine appreciation in the room. Players understood how difficult it was, how much practice it must have taken to develop. Beck unplugged, feeling satisfied. He noticed Jimi watching from across the room, that same quiet attention he seemed to give everything. Beck walked over, carrying his Telecaster. "Jeff Beck," he said, extending his hand. "I know," Jimi replied, shaking it. "That was something else. What were you doing with both hands on the neck?" Beck explained the technique, demonstrated it again on the unplugged guitar so Jimi could see the mechanics up close. "It's two-handed tapping," Beck said. "I've been working on it for months. As far as I know, nobody else is doing it yet. Give it 10 years and everyone will probably figure it out. But right now it's just me." There was pride in Beck's voice. Not arrogant, but confident. He'd found something new, claimed unexplored territory on the guitar, and he knew it. "Can I try?" Jimi asked. Beck hesitated for just a second. His Telecaster was personal, set up exactly how he liked it. But curiosity won out. He wanted to see if Jimi could even figure out the basic mechanics. "Sure," Beck said, handing over the guitar. Jimi took the Telecaster, sat down, positioned it on his lap. He tried the tapping motion Beck had shown him, fingers moving tentatively at first, searching for the right pressure, the right angle. Beck watched, expecting Jimi to struggle with it, to need time to build the coordination required. But within maybe 20 seconds, Jimi had the basic mechanics down. His fingers found the pattern, understood the principle. Beck felt a small flicker of surprise, but told himself it made sense. Jimi was clearly a competent player. Getting the mechanics wasn't the hard part. Mastering it, making it musical, that took months of dedicated practice. Then something shifted in Jimmy's playing. He'd figured out the tapping pattern, but instead of just repeating it cleanly like Beck had demonstrated, he started bending the tapped notes, adding vibrato, letting some notes ring while others decayed. The technique that Beck had used to create precise, cascading runs became something else in Jimmy's hands, something fluid and vocal. Beck watched Jimmy's hands trying to understand what was different. The mechanics were the same, but the result was completely different. Beck's version had sounded impressive, technically dazzling. Jimmy's version sounded like it was singing, like it was telling a story. Then Jimi did something Beck hadn't considered. He took the tapping technique and combined it with string bending, pulling notes sharp while simultaneously tapping harmonics above them, creating these crying, soaring phrases that seemed to defy the physics of what a guitar should be able to do. He wasn't just playing notes anymore. He was playing emotions. Beck watched Jimmy's face as he played. There was no showmanship, no awareness of the audience. Jimmy's eyes were half closed, his expression somewhere between concentration and meditation. He looked like he was listening to something only he could hear, translating it through his fingers onto the fretboard. The Telecaster, Beck's familiar instrument with its known limitations and predictable responses, suddenly sounded like an entirely different guitar. Like Jimi had found rooms inside it that Beck had walked past for years without noticing the doors. What unsettled Beck most wasn't the technical facility, though that was remarkable. It was the casualness of it. Jimi wasn't laboring over the technique the way Beck had for months. He wasn't concentrating on finger placement or timing. He'd absorbed the mechanics instantly and moved past them to something Beck couldn't quite name. Musical intuition, maybe, or emotional honesty, or some combination of both that Beck had spent his whole career trying to develop and still couldn't access the way Jimi did, without apparent effort. The room had gone quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet than when Beck had played. This wasn't technical appreciation. This was something deeper. People weren't watching Jimmy's hands trying to figure out how he was doing it. They were just listening, absorbed in what the guitar was saying. Beck noticed a session player he knew, a bassist who'd worked with everyone from the Stones to the Kinks, standing with his eyes closed, swaying slightly. That's when Beck understood the fundamental difference. His tapping technique had impressed people, made them think. Jimmy's use of it made them feel. Beck stood perfectly still, his own Telecaster in Jimmy's hands, producing sounds Beck had never imagined it could make. He felt something complicated happening inside him. Part fascination, part confusion, part something that felt uncomfortably close to inadequacy. Jimi played for maybe 2 minutes, never repeating the same phrase twice, constantly finding new ways to use the tapping technique that Beck had spent months developing. Every variation felt natural, musical, inevitable. Like this was what the technique had always been meant for, and Beck had just been scratching the surface. When Jimi stopped, he looked at Beck with genuine appreciation. "That's beautiful, man. Thank you for showing me that." Beck took his guitar back, unable to respond immediately. "Thank you for showing me?" He'd shown Jimi a technical exercise, a mechanical trick. What Jimi had just done wasn't a trick. It was music. "Where did you learn to do that?" Beck finally asked, his voice quieter than he'd intended. "Do what?" Jimi seemed genuinely confused. "That, all of that, taking the tapping and making it sound like that." Jimi shrugged slightly. "I just heard what the guitar wanted to say with it. You showed me the technique. I just tried to use it to say something." Beck nodded slowly, processing this. He'd spent months perfecting a technique because it was difficult, because it was new, because it proved his mastery of the instrument. Jimi had picked it up in 30 seconds and immediately asked a different question. Not how do I do this, but what does this let me say? Other people in the club were talking now, processing what they'd just heard. Someone asked Jimi to play something else. Beck stepped back, let someone else take his place in the conversation. He needed to think. Over the next hour, Beck watched Jimi play a few more songs with other musicians. Nothing showy, nothing aggressive, just Jimi fitting into whatever musical context presented itself, always listening, always serving the music rather than his ego. Beck noticed how Jimmy's technical ability was immense, probably equal to or greater than his own, but Jimmy never led with that. The technique was always in service of expression, never the point itself. Later that night, as people started leaving, Beck found himself standing next to Jimmy near the door. "Can I ask you something?" Beck said. "Of course." "When you play, are you thinking about the technique, about where your fingers need to go?" Jimmy considered this. "Sometimes when I'm learning something new, but once I know how to do it, I stop thinking about my hands. I just think about what I want the guitar to say, and my hands find their way there. The technique is just the language. It's not the thing I'm trying to communicate." Beck had never thought about it that way. For him, mastering technique was the goal. Each new skill unlocked was the achievement in itself. The idea that technique was just a tool, a means to an end rather than the end itself, felt both obvious and revolutionary. They talked for a while longer, standing outside the club as taxis passed and London moved through its late-night rhythms. Jimmy asked Beck about his time with the Yardbirds, about his approach to tone and effects. Beck found himself admitting things he rarely said out loud, how he sometimes felt trapped by his own precision, how his pursuit of technical perfection sometimes made his playing feel cold. "It's not cold," Jimmy said. "It's focused. That's valuable. Music needs both precision and emotion. They're not opposites." Beck looked at him. "But you don't seem to struggle with that balance. You just play." "I struggled," Jimmy said quietly. "Still do sometimes. There are nights I get so caught up in trying to make the guitar do something new that I forget to make it say something true. The technique becomes a wall between me and the audience instead of a bridge. I have to remind myself that nobody cares how difficult something is to play. They care how it makes them feel." This admission surprised Beck. He'd assumed Jimmy's emotional directness came naturally, that he'd never had to work for it. The idea that Jimmy actively fought against his own technical obsessions, that he consciously chose feeling over flash, made what he'd done with the tapping technique even more impressive. It wasn't instinct. It was discipline of a different kind. In the years that followed, Beck's playing changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually. He still pursued technical excellence, still spent hours working out complex fingerings and innovative approaches. But he started asking different questions about what he was doing. Not just can I play this, but what am I saying with it? His later work, with the Jeff Beck Group and beyond, showed a new emotional depth layered over his technical mastery. Beck and Jimmy crossed paths a few more times before Jimmy's death in 1970. They never became close friends, but there was mutual respect. Jimmy would reference Beck's technical innovations in interviews, praising his precision. Beck would talk about Jimmy's emotional directness, his ability to make the guitar speak. When Jimmy died, Beck was in a recording session. Someone told him the news between takes. He didn't say anything for a long moment, then quietly asked if they could take a break. He went outside, sat in his car, and thought about that night in Soho, about watching Jimmy take his carefully developed technique and show him what it was really for. Years later, in a 1985 interview for Guitarist magazine, Beck was asked about his development as a player, about the moments that changed his approach to the instrument. "There was a night in London," Beck said. "Must have been '67. I showed Jimi Hendrix this tapping technique I'd been working on. I was quite proud of it. Thought I'd discovered something nobody else knew. I demonstrated it, showed him the mechanics, and he asked if he could try. I handed him my guitar, expecting him to struggle with it, to need time to get the coordination right." "And," the interviewer prompted, "and he got it immediately, not just the mechanics, but what it could be used for. He played it back to me, and it was the same technique, but it was music, real music. I'd been so focused on mastering the technique that I'd forgotten to ask what the technique was for. I'd been treating it as an end in itself. Jimmy treated it as a means of expression. He showed me the difference between playing guitar and making music." "Did that bother you? Seeing him do more with your technique than you'd managed?" Beck smiled slightly. "At the time, yes. My ego took a bit of a beating, but ultimately it was the best lesson anyone ever taught me. I'd spent months perfecting this technique, and in 2 minutes, Jimmy showed me I'd been asking the wrong questions about it. I was asking, how do I do this? He was asking, what can I say with this?" That shift in perspective changed everything for me. Do you still use that tapping technique? Sometimes when it serves the music, but I'm not attached to it the way I was before that night. It's just one tool among many. Jimmy taught me that the technique doesn't matter if you're not saying anything with it. You can have all the technical ability in the world, but if you're not communicating something real, something human, you're just making noise. The interviewer asked if Beck ever recorded anything using that tapping technique as a tribute to Jimmy. Not specifically as a tribute, no. But everything I've played since that night has been influenced by what he showed me. The way I approach the guitar now, the questions I ask about my playing, the balance between precision and emotion, that all comes from watching Jimmy take something I thought was mine and show me it belonged to music, not to any one player. The story of that night in Soho never became as famous as some of the other Jimi Hendrix encounters. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public displays, no careers destroyed, just two guitarists in a basement club, one showing the other a technique, the other showing the first what the technique could mean. But for Jeff Beck, it was the night he learned the difference between mastering an instrument and serving music. The night he realized technical perfection was worthless without emotional truth. The night Jimi Hendrix picked up his Telecaster and taught him that how you play matters less than what you say. Beck went on to have one of the most influential careers in rock guitar, pioneering techniques and approaches that shaped generations of players. But he always remembered that night, the night he thought he'd show Jimi Hendrix something new, and instead learned the most important lesson of his musical life. I showed him a technique, Beck said near the end of that 1985 interview. He showed me music. That's the difference between us. I was a technician trying to become an artist. He was an artist who happened to have technique. And that night in Soho, he showed me which one mattered more.